And just a word of welcome from myself, Peter Crooks. I'm from Trinity College Dublin, and it's my privilege to be the director of Beyond 2022, which means I get to work with fantastic collaborators. And this is a very exciting event for the project for two reasons. Firstly, because today we are really witnessing the first fruits of a collaboration that dates back quite a number of years at this point. I first wrote to Michael Willis in, I think it was November 2016. It takes time for collaborations to truly develop. But Michael has now been supporting the project for all those years. He's the longest serving member of our international advisory panel. He's been joined by other core partners, his fellow directors, Jeff James of the National Archives UK, our new director of the National Archives Ireland and Dublin, Orla McBride, John McCafferty is chair of the Irish Manuscripts Commission, and Helen Shenton, the librarian of Trinity College Dublin. But Michael has been there really right from the beginning, and during that time he has been unstinting in his support. And what's very exciting now is that we're in the phase 2 of the project. It's now funded with significant investment from the Irish government through the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. And that expanded phase 2 investment has borne fruit in embedding researchers both in Proni in Belfast and in our other core partner in the UK, the National Archives, the National Archives of the UK. So today is our first real experience of how that collaboration is going to continue to grow across the next 21 months. And we really look forward to hearing more about the riches of Proni's collections in the course of today's activities. The second reason why it's very exciting for me is because this is, for the project, our first truly hybrid event. We would have loved to have been with everybody in Titanic Quarter in Proni. We hope you're all safe and well wherever you are. But I am, just like Michael, I want to echo what he said, hugely appreciative of all the energy and enthusiasm of Proni's team and my own colleagues and collaborators who have devised today's event. We've become sort of accidentally multimedia experts. We've got people physically in Titanic Quarter. We have live stream from participants in Dublin and Belfast. We have other participants who have contributed through pre-recording based in the University of Maynooth and in the National Archives UK, and we have immersive 3D. So this is a truly exciting event today, and in a way we wouldn't have imagined it in quite this way if it wasn't for the terrible circumstances of the pandemic. But it is in the spirit of Beyond 2022, which is about international collaboration and making archives accessible, both in the sense of public engagement and in the sense of providing digital access through the Virtual Record Treasury. So I'll finish in a minute. We'll begin this session really by going back to the future and remembering why we're all here. Michael has mentioned the disaster of 1922 itself. The centenary is now 21 months away. And later in the afternoon, you'll be taken on a live tour of the virtual archive that we are creating. That's the first time we'll be sharing that as a functional space with a public audience. But we'll set the scene now for this session with a video which takes us back to the fire of 1922 and that context of archival destruction, and then forward to how we imagine the virtual space will be experienced in the centenary of 2022. That's the ambition, the common framework, the common goal of this collaboration, that we're working to turn virtual space into a reality that we can all enjoy together. And today is a major milestone on that journey. So thank you very much and enjoy today's sessions.
Dublin, June 30th, 1922. Day 3 of the Battle of the Four Courts, the opening engagement of the Irish Civil War. Shortly after noon, the city is shaken by a huge explosion. After the blast, fire takes hold and plumes of white smoke are seen billowing from an arcade of tall windows in a corner of the Four Courts complex. This is the Record Treasury of Ireland's Public Record Office. Irish history, dating back over 700 years, is on fire. Inside the Record Treasury, the intense heat melts the high ironwork galleries and shelving, casting paper and parchment records into the flames below. Miraculously, one part of the building survives almost intact, except for a blast hole in the side wall. The record house, and at its heart, the handsome search room, where researchers pored over historical documents, had escaped the worst of the damage. Now supported by the Government of Ireland, the Beyond 2022 project is reconstructing the search room in virtual reality. Here, readers in 1922 conducted their research beneath the natural light of a beautiful glazed ceiling. And for the first time in a century, we can reopen the double doors that led to the record treasury, passing through the fire break which stopped the blaze spreading to the front of the building. On the centenary of the fire, 4 steps will take you on your journey through Ireland's virtual record treasury. Explore, locate, connect, discover. Entering through the record house, you can admire its elegant staircase before passing into the search room where your discoveries begin. From here, you can search the archive and travel to the very place in the lofty galleries of the Treasury where the records destroyed in 1922 have been reassembled from surviving copies and transcripts located in archives across Ireland and around the world. Now, next generation technology enables you to visualize the whole archive and make connections in ways that were unimaginable a century ago. Returning to the search room, you can discover more about the people, places, and topics contained in the documents. Beyond 2022, unlocking the story of Ireland and its peoples across 7 centuries, and reopening a lost archive to new generations with new questions.
Well, thank you very much for the introductions, Peter and Michael, and hopefully that video has whetted everybody's appetite and give you a little flavour of what's to come for the rest of the afternoon. So first of all, I'm going to hand you across to my colleagues, Stephen Scarth, who's Head of Public Services at Proni, and Tim Murta, Research Fellow for the Beyond 2022 project.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Just double checking. All okay, great. Sorry. So Lindsay should be just in a second bringing up some slides I'd like to talk about today. I'm here to talk to you today as a research fellow here in Proni about the legacy of the fire of 1922 and how it relates to Proni as an archive. As you can see here with the title card, that's what I want to be speaking about today. And as Stephen will discuss shortly, the challenge of rebuilding lost archives is something that's very much a live issue, with some very staggering instances of cultural loss and historical loss occurring actually quite recently. And I would like to make the argument to you today that Proni is an institution that has a lot to contribute to discussions of archival loss and repair, as the issue goes right back to this institution's very origins. And on the next slide, we have an image of the interior of the Public Record Office of Ireland on the left, and on the right you have an image taken immediately after the fire of people picking up debris and documents and historical matter in the wake of that terrible, terrible fire. A fire that destroyed so much: medieval chancery and exchequer rolls, taxation and military records, wills, church records, political and administrative records of the British government in Ireland, a wealth of legal documents, to name just a few categories. Now, if we go to the next slide, we have an image. The image of the chief archivist, the deputy keeper of the Public Record Office of Ireland, Herbert Woods. And this heartbreaking photo captures Woods sifting through the rubble of the archive that he had done so much to help shape. Unsurprisingly, Wood decided to retire from his post following the destruction of the forecourts, where he would eventually return to England, where he remained active in searching for replacements for the destroyed Irish records, finding replacements and substitutes in British repositories. However, he remained in contact with archivists in Ireland, most notably maintaining a very close correspondence with Belfast, and one man in particular on the next slide. The man depicted, on the next slide, David Alfred Chart, who had been a former colleague of Wood, working alongside him in the Public Record Office until 1921. It was in 1921 that Chart, pictured here, had transferred to Belfast to work in Northern Ireland's new Ministry of Finance. It was Chart who was largely responsible for the setting up of Proni in 1923, and he would act as its head for nearly 25 years. From the start, Chart pushed for Proni to do more than simply take custody of the new documents being produced by Northern Ireland's various government departments. He instead argued that it should have a wider remit, seeking out older material relating to the unique history of Ulster. As a result, the legislation that established Proni empowered it to collect a wide array of historical material. Now, Chart himself spent considerable time investigating and copying documents in British archives. If you go to the next slide, we have some examples. He ensured that Proni accepted church records, educational records, local government records, some of this material was not initially considered in the 19th century to constitute public records, but he made the argument quite early on that they should become part of the public repository to compensate for the loss of documents in 1922. Chart engaged with the public, reaching out, asking individuals to deposit original documents and potential substitutes, although these public appeals were not always the most productive. However, he also targeted certain sectors like the legal profession, encouraging solicitors to deposit their records, which was of vital importance. Chart's efforts to find substitute material could occasionally be tragic-comic. In 1928, he was forced to investigate a report in the Daily Mail newspaper that Irish wills and historical documents once held in the forecourts had been recovered from the ruins after the fire and had been sold on as scrap paper to a London dealer who was pulping them to turn them into lampshades. Now, Chart duly investigated and discovered that what was being pulped were indeed copies of testamentary papers, but only copies of originals which were still held in public archives. Now, going on to the next slide, I've titled this one Important Family Collections. Again, an important initiative spearheaded by Chart. Chart sought out documents in private possession by appealing to wealthy landowning families in Northern Ireland. Notably, he convinced the Duke of Abercorn, pictured here, who was the first governor of Northern Ireland and a significant landowner in his own right, to appeal to other families of his own class to donate their family archives to Proni. Now, the collection donated by Abercorn himself is one of the most significant collections in Proni, but the impact of Abercorn's appeal was wider than that, because Proni now holds some very impressive family collections, some of which I have listed here. Now, if we go on to the next slide, I've also included a category which I call pre-1922 transcripts. Should be on. Next one. Yeah, here we go. Now, Chart and admittedly all subsequent deputy keepers were careful to continue soliciting the great and the good for their records, but they also sought out direct transcripts of destroyed material, particularly the papers of genealogists and antiquaries. And I've provided two little examples here. The papers of the genealogist Tennyson Groves, a very substantial collection held in Proni, are one very rich source. Not only genealogical and census-like material, but also transcripts of government and civil correspondence. Another family, who we have a record here, are the McCants family, who in addition to doing their own personal familial research, also transcribed certain sections of now lost military records. If you click onto the next slide, I'd like to just highlight one thing that we can offer you today, which is some digital offerings on the Beyond 22 website. Some minister rolls from County Tyrone relating to the 17th century and local law and order issues. And on the right, we have a shot of the Delafield extracts, which were a series of transcriptions done in the early 1900s from medieval exchequer and chancery rolls. These are now accessible via the replacement collection section on the Beyond 22 website. And moving on to our final slide on my half of the talk, what I've said is building a virtual record treasury, something you're going to get a lot more of and a lot more information about in the second session later today. But this image that I've put on this slide, of the search room of the Public Records Office of Ireland before 1922. This image might seem quite sad. It's an image of a now lost archive. But through institutions like Proni, substantial sections of that archive can be restored with the help of Beyond 2022. Yet the legacy of the fire of 1922 is nonetheless a significant one. Proni, as a successor institution to that archive, has been shaped by that event, not just in finding substitutes for what was burnt, but in planning against further loss. And to further describe what Proni holds and how it has been impacted by the fire, I'd like to hand over to Stephen Scarth of Proni, who has chosen to confront a horrifying hypothetical. What if there was a fire in Proni today?
Afternoon, everybody. And yes, Tim's talked about setting up a Proni. I'm now going to pose the question today: what would be the impact if Proni was destroyed by fire in 2022? This may sound a bit fatalistic. The reality is that in recent years, there have been a number of catastrophic fires at major cultural institutions. As the next slide will show, Rennie Mackintosh Library, you'll probably all have seen this in the news, not destroyed once, but twice. And in the slide afterwards, we have yet another catastrophe. This is Notre Dame Cathedral, and let's do one more slide. And National Museum of Brazil, and as you can see, absolutely gutted. This resulted in total destruction of their records. In our hypothetical scenario, the worst case would be that we would lose the entire 54 kilometers of Proni's connections, which have been amassed over the past 100 years. That doesn't just include records which are already open to the public, but it's records that remain closed and nobody has accessed yet. So if you thought the biggest tragedy of the fire of 1922 was the loss of 3 sets of census records, I have some very bad news for you. Can we see the next slide? In this building, we have 9 more sets of census records, all waiting to go up in fire in the event. And now that doesn't include the first ever census of Northern Ireland, which took place in 1926. That is already a casualty to history and has not survived. So our oldest surviving census is 1937. And as you can see, following 1951, censuses were held every year, with an added one in 1966. And we have them from 37 up to 2011. If we go into the next slide, this is an example of a census substitute. It's called the 1939 registers. The 1939 registers were organized as part of the UK's contingency plans for war to ensure that the UK had a full list of the population. The information was subsequently used for rationing purposes. The registers list addresses, names of resident, alongside date of birth, marital status, and occupation. And if we go into the next slide, we can see the theme of name-rich lists again. This is an example of church record. If we hit the next slide, Lindsay, this is a school register, and next one. This is a burial register from a local authority. We also have records of Ulster Home Guard, Ulster Special Constabulary, which have to date remained closed, but staff are working on getting the 1920s material open as part of marking Proni's own centenary, which, let me highlight, is coming up in 2023. We'd also lose the largest set of Irish immigrant letters in the world. Next slide, please. And immigrant letters are as much about Ireland as they are about North America, Australia, and New Zealand. The immigrants remained in many practical as well as psychological ways deeply involved with their homelands. Often these migrants provide a commentary on the state of Ireland, including social, economic, and religious conditions. They also include responses from those who stayed behind. We then turn to the records of the great and the good in and these could also have been consigned, would also be consigned to history. Proni's Land of the States, Tim mentioned Duke of Abercorn. We have many more. Now, in many instances, landed estates records are the only surviving resource for undertaking 17th and 18th century family, local and academic history. Most estates scrupulously recorded details of the tenants in their rentals. This is a rental in this example. Leases recorded whose land was leased to. And if we go to the next slide, we can also see you have maps which identify exactly where tenants live. They also provide an insight into how an estate is managed. Some will include architectural drawings of houses which have long ceased to exist. And in the case of those landowners engaged in politics and government, the correspondence often includes surrogates of administrative records lost in the 1923 fire. As in 1922, not everything would be consigned to history. If we go to the next slide. The records that would survive through digitization include valuation records, historic ordnance survey maps, tithe allotment books, transcripts of wills, the Ulster Covenant, and some of our more recent church records such as St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast, St Colum's Cathedral in Derry. And Proni has also engaged with educational publishing companies, as in this example. The company was called Gale, and they microfilmed the Northern Ireland Cabinet conclusions 1921 to 72. So these have been digitized and are available. So that's material that we know would survive any fire. Now, however, if we go to the last slide, it's and the next one. Sorry, I should have mentioned that one. However, it is the Proni building itself which offers the best form of defense against loss of records. Every preventative measure possible has been taken. The stores themselves have been elevated a metre above ground level to cater for the 1 in a century tidal flood that could come hurtling down Belfast Lough. All stores are humidity and temperature controlled. Fire suppression is controlled through the installation of a mist system. A mist system is comprised of a spray of small atomized water droplets, which when released, deprives the flames of oxygen and extinguishes heat. And mist has the advantage over sprinklers in that the use of sprinklers can in itself result in significant water damage. Document security remains fundamental to our operations, which is why we have invigilated reading rooms, CCTV, why we require proof of identity for registration. And in the event of a fire, we have a disaster salvage team comprising key members of Proni staff. The salvage operation is something that needs to take place at speed, as the biggest risk to damaged documents comes from mold. And one other preservation feature that mitigates risk is that most collections are stored in enclosures, e.g. acidity boxes and cyclopacks. So in conclusion, we need to continue to be vigilant. The records we hold constitute the community memory of the 6 northern counties of Ireland. Many of those records compensate for what was lost in 1922, but their enduring testament is that they have survived, and their survival enriches us all. It's now my pleasure to pass over to Zoe Reid, the head conservator at National Archives of Ireland. Thank you.
Here we go. Hello everybody, thank you very much Stephen. Sobering indeed, the thoughts about what could happen if a disaster were to strike any of our cultural institutions. I have a few slides that I pulled together today that really will demonstrate the amazing job that I have, in the sense that I'm the very lucky person who gets to pick up literally where they left off in 1922, 1923. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just run through what I'm going to do. So the salvage of documents began very quickly after the tragic event on the 30th of June, and the staff were supported both by the new government at the time and officers of the OPW to go in and start salvaging documents out of the rubble. There's very little kind of information, documentary information, to tell me exactly what they did, but I'm piecing it together by the work that they left behind, and that's hugely exciting to do. So what we can tell is, and what we've always known is, that the staff went in, we figured out from looking at various documents that they went in, they salvaged material, they identified it, then they had a room in the record office in Dublin Castle, and that's where they took the dirty archives, which were covered in building rubble and soot and dirt, and took them in there, and that's where they identified them working together. And that process, they spent about a year doing that work. What they left behind were a series of parcels that very much are what they identified and found, and the date range of materials from the 13th to the 20th century, so a huge scope of material there. In the next slide we see a document that was written in 1928 from James Morrissey, who became the keeper after Herbert Woods retired, where he gives us that timeline on that date, and that's literally just a single document in an office file that we're able to track down and come across. And then we move in the next slide up to 2017. And in 2017, we were in the National Archives really fortunate to receive funding from the Irish Manuscripts Commission, which allowed us to do a concentrated project on the parcels. For a long time, the staff in the National Archives have been very aware that this needed attention and wanted to do the work, but we also knew that it would be a very focused job and quite a difficult job to do, but also incredibly exciting. And so with the funding we received from the Irish Manuscripts Commission, we were able to do a 16-week concentrated project. We started off at under sort of about 270 odd boxes. And then when we did the survey, we opened it up, it turned into 378 parcels. And that's an example of some of the small parcels there, but you can see just how neatly they were wrapped up, how well they were documented in the terms of what the contents were thought to be. And the results of that survey in the next slide, you can see over the 5 months, or over the 16 weeks, what we did was we, as conservators do, we like to know about the condition of things. So we said, is it in good condition or is it in really awful condition? And we devised a numerical grading system. And there you've got, we're begun, some of the large numbers where you're beginning to see the extent of what was actually in those 378 parcels. And that's where we're beginning to build up a very solid picture of what we have. And just to break that down in the next slide, I've got an example of a document that we graded. I'm very sure that's a 4 because there's a possibility we might be able to conserve it. But you can see as well the grade 1s and with the material that was actually in very good condition. I'll talk about those a little bit later. The grade 2s, the 3s, the 4s. The grade 4s are obviously the contents, the stuff is the largest selection, and then the grade 5s were the things that really were in quite shocking condition. But obviously the staff at the time felt it important to pick them up. They could identify something on them that could tell them what they were, and they held on to them, and we're doing the same thing. We're holding on to them. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. If we move on to the next slide, it comes to after the survey. So what do? Well, conservators like to get in and get their hands dirty and get the work started. So we began with the conservation of the 28 parcels, essentially contents of those parcels that were in the best condition. And again, there was another very short project that focused on the cleaning and the housing of those documents. And one of the highlights that came out of those, there were a number of highlights, but one highlight were these documents from 1798, these yeomanry returns from County Carlow. And if you were watching the video earlier, you would have seen where the guys in the virtual repository have been able to identify where they would have been within the repository in 1922. And what I began to realize was that whilst this was very exciting, I began to realize that for archivists and historians, this was maybe not the best way to go about the conservation, the future conservation of the rest of the project. So if I move on to the next slide, I'll explain that a bit more. What I began to realize was if I was only conserving things as their condition, it meant when I was giving it to historians and archivists to list, it was a little bit like a pick and mix. It was a little bit of something and a little bit of something else. So what I've been able to do is go back and actually look at what the record keepers did back in 1922, 1923. And of course, that realization, they were of course record keepers and archivists, so they made lists. and they organized things. They were incredibly organized. So I went back and looked, and we realized that there's a series of revenue exchequers, collectors' accounts. And we realized that's a complete series of work. So what we're starting to do is the conservation of material from that collection. And because that then means once they're conserved, we can give them to archivists and historians, and they have a tangible series to list and information gather from and collect that data. So that's what we've started to do. And by the eagle-eyed Ulster people amongst the audience will definitely see that in that type list, you can see Donaghad's there, Colerane's there. So if we move on to the next slide, we can start to see that's exactly what I did. I started to pull out the documents relating to Ulster. And so here we've got Coleraine Port and District, we've got Donaghadee Port and District, and Strangford, and those are the three ones. And you can see the number of parcels that we had relating to each of those areas, the date range of the material, and this is an example of the Donaghadee. I'm fairly sure that, no, that's Coleraine. See, they all begin to look alike, so they all have to be identified. That's one of the Coleraine parcels. And to show that a little bit in better detail in the next slide, you're opening them up, and you'll see within the Coleraine Port and District, you can see the types of documents we've got. And these are all primarily paper documents. They're abstracts of hearth money, they're vouchers, quarterly accounts. They're all related to the port, to money coming into the port at various times. And from a conservative point of view, I'm looking at them not so much as what they say, but as to what they are and how they physically are. So I'm looking whether they're folded sheets of paper or double sheets of paper, whether they're stitched account books, or whether they're perhaps documents written on parchment, which is an animal skin. And so the next slide should show, here we've got Donaghadee. And again, just to begin to break down and show exactly what small bundle, how much it might contain in terms of information that you can gather up. This is, there were some records relating to Donaghadee Port and District 1725, 8 items, but it turned into actually 60 pages and 70 different types of parchment. And I'm happy to say that they have all been conserved now. This is an example of one of the pages that was in a stitched account book. And I suppose the reason I particularly love this one is it's not often you see your hometown written down in a document from 1725. So I'm actually originally from Bangor. And I love seeing this list of the guys who would have been in and around the port in Donaghadee in 1725 and wondering if they all went off to Grace Neal's for a jar of ale afterwards. If we look on to the next slide, I'll show you an example of Strangford. On Strangford Port and District, these are ones that really show that, I suppose, the devastation and the effect of being in amongst building rubble for a best part of 6-9 months after the destruction of the Public Record Office. And again, I was working on this document in particular yesterday, and I said here in the slides that we've got 4 books of port or books of discharge, and one of them, as I was separating it to clean it all, it's fairly badly mold damaged. It's actually 180 different pieces of paper. And then again, you can start to see and build and get a picture and the idea of just exactly how much information could potentially be in these documents. So I'll talk a little bit about the conservation by the next slide. Again, this is some of the Donaghadee stuff. You can see the things that I'm identifying are essentially water damage, which has resulted in historic mold, which is covering some of the text. So that's something I've got to remove. I've got the challenge of working a lot, especially with the early 18th century material. It's written in iron gall ink, and iron gall ink can be problematic both in terms of how it affects paper as it ages, but also in terms of conservation treatment. And it tends to be, especially when things, these accounts, collectors' accounts, when they're in books, it's the outer pages, as you would have seen on that slide from Strangford, that very much have borne the brunt of the damage. Some of the inner pages actually are in incredible condition, incredibly clear writing, incredibly clear to read, which is very exciting. The next slide shows an example of, if you can see, that's actually one of the top sheets of Donaghadee. one of those accounts, and that's just cleaning off the dust and the dirt using conservation techniques such as very specialized sponges and erasers to remove that initial layer of dirt and dust and debris off the documents. And the next slide, I think I get to get the fun part. This is the washing and repair. So again, as I said, I've completed the work on Donaghadee. So this is some of the examples of the documents after they've been washed. And the washing is there to try and remove the discoloration and the mold staining out of the paper. But then you come on to the areas of damage. And I've listed here the 2 types of paper that I've been using to repair the damage. But if we go to the next slide, hopefully you'll get to see what I'm doing. And here, you can see 2 examples of the bottom half of a document, and I wasn't happy with the picture on the left. The tissue's too heavy. You can't see the text. And with conservation, especially with conservation within archives, one thing conservators are very concerned about and aware of is that it's making sure that the text and the information and the data can be clearly seen. So actually the tissue on the left I removed. I wasn't happy with that. Again, I used a tissue half the weight and a different type of adhesive. I used gelatin to repair this document. And if we move on to the next slide, we should be able to see a before and after. So that's what one of the bifolios from Donaghadee from 1726 looked like before. Now I'd cleaned it, but before it got its full treatment, and then that's the pages afterwards, after they've been repaired and flattened. And as you can see from historians and researchers and archivists' point of view, they're going to be a lot easier to use and to handle, and a lot easier to read, which that's pretty satisfying. And actually, it's one of those things, you work away on documents as a conservator, but until you see a before and after picture like that, you kind of go, okay, that was a good day's work. So I'm pretty pleased with that. If we move on to the next slide, I think I've got an account of John Bailey. And again, this is from Donaghadee, but this is a different type of material. I thought it would be interesting to show what you can do. So this document is written on parchment. It's quite a large document. And again, what we want to be able to do from a conservator's point of view is make it easier to handle, for it to be read, and also for storage as well, to make sure that we can continue to look after it and that it stays secure. And the next slide will show, hopefully in 4 easy pictures, how I managed to do that. So we're starting from left to right. We've got the document where I've just got some beaded weights on it. So that's it, very much first unfolded. That's the first photograph I took of it. Then you've got the surface cleaning of it. And then the photograph with all the funny little bits of white paper and things, little dots around it, those are actually magnets. And that's a technique I use for introducing humidity or moisture into the vellum, into the skin, and to get it flat, to remove the distortions. And if we go to the picture on the very far right, there you can see it's after it's been conserved. It's the same document, but now it's clean, it's easier to use, it can be handled and read safely in the reading room by researchers. So that's some of the conservation magic that I can do. And then to progress conservation, to go on to the next slide, I've shown you examples of what I can do, and those are very much daily part and parcel of my work. But there will also be, and the project being part of a partnership with Beyond 2022 and the other institutions is very exciting, because it gives us an opportunity to look beyond the conservation room doors, very much to talk to project partners, to conservation research scientists, and to perhaps look at some of the more extraordinary and exciting scientific techniques for text retrieval and information. We wouldn't have in-house in the National Archives some of these amazing equipment and machineries, but other organizations do. So we're looking at things like a thing called X-ray tomography, multispectral imaging, which where the writing or text is faded will help give us images to enhance and be able to read the text more clearly. And then another thing called Fourier transfer infrared spectrometry for analysis, again, of writing material, to look at what materials were used to create these documents. And very much from a conservator, that's of huge interest to us. I tend not to read the words so much, but I'm more focused on what the documents are made of, how they're written, what they're made from. So that's something that we're hoping to progress, and will be progressing throughout the project. And just onto my last slide, as a small kind of, there should be some websites there that people can look at, but that's really to just acknowledge the work of the project team so far. This work isn't just done by me, it's done by a number of people. I'm very, very grateful to them, and we're at the very exciting position where we're actually looking to have a new project conservator come and join the team. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
So, am I on now?
That's you, Dave, yes.
That's me. Great. We missed a link there, because linking from Zoe to me is like going from the complicated bit of investigative journalism to the sports results, because all I have to do now is show and tell. And I would probably dispute that Zoe has the best job on this project, because I just get to travel around the place, going to really nice buildings all the time in beautiful settings and looking at treasures to find the replacement item for what was lost, which has now become more of a virtual undertaking. But it's still an awful lot of fun, and as a virtual project, we should be able to do most of our work virtually. I'm just going to share a screen now to show you how we're going to approach today. So what we have is a empty virtual building, complete with empty virtual shelves to start off with. The idea of this session is to show you how we can take items that we have found in multiple libraries and archives to put together what was in the Public Record Office of Ireland and to answer a very simple historical question. So imagine you're walking into the building with this simple historical question, which will reveal itself in a second. We now have a very good idea of what was on these shelves, thanks to Kieran Wallace's rediscovery of the PROI's original accession of increment books. We understand the scale of the destruction now, and we have to cast our net very wide to recover as much as possible. So in addition to what they have in Proni for Northern Ireland, which is the largest collection by some distance, we also now have added to that lots of pieces from lots of other archives. So this 10-minute session is going to look at the history of one small town, Aughor, in County Tyrone. And we want to reconstruct the history of the town using sources from these 5 different institutions. From Proni, we will look at material from the National Archives in the UK, from the Library of the Houses of the Oireachtas, from the British Library and the Royal Irish Academy. Now, all of these places have copies of things that were in the Public Record Office of Ireland before 1922 and have now been destroyed. You could have gone into the building and asked to see everything they had to do with Aughor, and they would have pulled all these things out, but now we have to do this virtually. But we can do that now on our platform, where we will put everything back on the shelves virtually from these various libraries. So Aughor is a small town in mid-Ulster. It's basically just a village. It has a population of about 400. It was selected for today's exercise because it is not particularly well known outside of its immediate locality, which makes it a good test, because Aughor is typical of many small towns whose historical record was destroyed in 1922, unlike large cities for which there were already many written histories and multiple archival sources. So the smaller the settlement, the larger the archival discovery challenge, and that's what we're trying to achieve. This is an aerial view of Aughor. It's courtesy of Google, but the picture doesn't really tell you much about the history of the town. Google labels the spar, but not Spur Royal Castle, which is built on the ruins of Aughor Castle. Which isn't a criticism, it's just the way Google do things. They have their own priorities. So to find out more, we'll go to our first rediscovered or recovered record and do a little bit of virtual archaeology, which is much easier than actual archaeology, or what our computer science colleagues might call analog archaeology. So we have a map which was created in 1609 to facilitate the plantation of Ulster Aughor Castle is the most important and actually the only built feature that's depicted in the area. The course of the river Blackwater on this map matches neatly with the satellite image, and the location of the lake is in pretty much the right place. So it's not bad for a 400-year-old map. The map is part of a set by Josias Bodley, and the original is in the National Archives in Kew, in London. Proni has a modern copy, but the PROI also had an early reproduction that they acquired.
Dave, could I cut in slowly? Your sound is fading in and out. Could you move your camera towards you a bit, possibly?
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Is that any better?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So again, this map is in Kew, the original. Proni has a modern copy, but the Public Record Office of Ireland also had an early reproduction. And it was used then as it's used now by historians of the plantation of Ulster. Aughor was created a borough by King James I in 1615 and awarded a municipal charter. And this picture is from a complete transcription of the original charter made by the Irish Record Commission in the early 19th century, and now in the library of the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. The Record Commission transcribed all of the original Irish municipal charters, and they now fill some 25-bound volumes. Half of these are in the RIA, and half in the National Archives of Ireland. The town charters list the first cohort of burgesses to be appointed, so from these we can make an initial list of the leading inhabitants. Edward Ridgway, the big local landowner, was appointed mayor of Aughor. The names of some other burgesses, Powell, Riley and Ridgway, are still common in the area. One burgess, Richard Fixer, is mentioned in the Summinister roll for County Tyrone by Tennyson Groves that Tim has mentioned already and that we're showcasing on the website today. So why the big deal with Aughor? Why does it need a charter? There was just a castle there. The reason for this was because during the plantation, they had a parliament in Ireland in 1615, and King James I decided that he wanted to pack out the parliament with planters, Scots and English, and try to outvote the existing Old English or Catholic Irish big landowners who would normally dominate the parliament. So he's dishing out these patents left, right and centre for towns that weren't really towns. It was just a castle in a lake, as you can see from the map, and that didn't really change. In the end, Ridgway got a license to start a distillery in 1616. So at least he had some way of passing the time. This map of the barony of Clogher is in Proni. It's an 18th century copy of a map originally in the PROI, and it was made for Sir William Petty's Down survey in the 1650s. And as the purpose of Petty's survey was to mark out Catholic-owned land for confiscation following Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, and as Clogher had already been planted, it is rather light on detail. But some urban buildings were liable for confiscation, and these are what were surveyed. So here we can see the first depiction of Aughor as a town. It's quite crude. This is a street plan because Aughor had one street, but of what was a growing market town because the street wasn't there before. The castle isn't shown as it wasn't on the list of properties to be confiscated, but we can see 7 stone-built houses. So just moving on a couple of years now to 1666, and we're building up a picture of what is now a growing market town, and this is a transcription of the Hearth Money Roll from 1666 that was copied in the PROI in 1908, and it's now in the British Library in London, so we've moved to another library to find another piece of the jigsaw, although all of these would have been on shelves quite close together in the original building. The hearth money was a tax levied on every hearth. Most houses only had one. The wealthy may have had several, so were expected to pay more, which seems quite progressive by modern standards, where the very wealthy now seem to pay less. The government had attempted a poll tax in 1660, but switched to a hearth tax after a few years. The difficulty with the poll tax was that people would simply run away when the tax collectors were coming, and it was more difficult to move a hearth quickly, so they managed to collect more money. According to the roll, 25 individuals were liable to pay the tax in Aughor, and that implies a population of about 125. Since the garrison of the castle or paupers or Irish living in crates without a permanent hearth did not have to pay the tax. The population of Aughar in 1666 was fairly similar to what it is now. We'll jump forward a century now, as we're running a bit short on time. And perhaps it's because we still have a lot of work to do in archival discovery, but not a lot seems to have happened in Aughar during the next 100 years. So our next example is issue number 685 of the Dublin Gazette, provided to Beyond 2022 by the Library Service of the Oireachtas in Dublin. Now, the Library Service of the Oireachtas, this is the House of Parliament in Dublin. They have actually quite a large collection of official records, because when they moved to Leinster House, they inherited the Chief Secretary's Office library from Dublin Castle, which was moved across. So it's become a very important source for us of copies of official records. The Dublin Gazette was published 2 or 3 times a week from 1707 till 1922, and the PROI had a complete set. One of our projects within a project is to reassemble the full series, as it is the newspaper of record for official Ireland. The Gazette printed all statutes and proclamations, and, for example, names of appointees to local regiments, so they would hopefully supplement what they have in Proni to do with regimental history, and that the Gazette does usually print the names of people as they are appointed, or indeed if they are deserted and on the run. It was a private publication, so the Gazette in its early years also did quite good lines in salacious gossip and gratuitous crime reporting, which is where Aughar now reappears in the public record. Now, if you have a delicate disposition, you should look away now, as we're seeing what is actually going on beneath the sleepy surface of Aughar. On the 19th of March 1757, we read about a brutal domestic murder, which seems to have been followed by a remorseful public suicide. Now, if you read the text carefully, I don't think we have time to do that, but from what little we know about Luden, the central character, he seems to have been blessed with unusual agility. He was able to tie his own hands and feet together before people came to investigate him. With this evidence, the clumsy error of failing to kill himself in front of his neighbours actually seems unlikely, because he was obviously very gifted with his hands. So he was probably lynched by his neighbours, who then conspired to invent this story for the local magistrate. And again, this issue of the Gazette is on the website now for the sample pages. It was not, it has to be said, typical Aughar behaviour, but if anybody wants to write a history of the town, this anecdote might help your book to sell. From the 18th century, local magistrates worked under the oversight of the county grand jury, and a copy of the grand jury records for all counties in Ireland were kept in the PROI. Proni now has an excellent collection for the 6 counties, and most county record offices throughout Ireland have kept quite complete collections in some cases of records that go back to the mid-18th century and up to the formation of county councils in the mid-19th. The grand juries commissioned their own maps, and this one by William McCrae and George Knox in 1813 depicts Aughar pretty much as it is today. So I'm just going to...
Over to Janet.
Yeah, no, so just to finish up, for a small town, Aughar has a lot of history. We chose it for this demonstration not because it's well known, but because it isn't well known. So it's our hope that when Beyond 2022 becomes publicly available, for most places in Ireland, you will be able to conduct this kind of research quite easily and from the comfort of your own homes. So we've set ourselves an ambitious challenge. So with that in mind now, I'll hand you back to Lindsay Gillespie, who will bring us forward.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second session. I hope you can hear me. To add my own thanks to the speakers from the first session, it was rather a gruesome session. If you think about Stephen Scarth's haunting image of the destruction of Proni, and then Dave Brown on the disemboweling in historic Aughar. So luckily we had Zoe Reid in the middle to show us the miraculous work she can do, bringing destruction back to recovery. We look forward to a very exciting session now. There were some sound issues in the last presentation. I have been in touch with David Brown during the break, and we'll make sure that that presentation is available through our website for anybody who wants to follow up on the detail, because the story he's telling there about how we can connect records through Beyond 2022 across collections and between different archives is one of the most powerful messages from the project, and we want to make sure that comes across as strongly as possible. As I said in my opening remarks, we would love to have been live physically in Titanic Quarter in Proni to mark today's presentation and to celebrate Proni's magnificent collection, which is helping to reconstruct what was lost in 1922. And also really to acknowledge the importance of the physical archive. This is a project that's creating a virtual archive, but our work is nothing without the expertise, the conservation efforts, the curation across the century of all our archival collaborators. But the next best thing, if we can't visit Titanic Quarter, is to bring Titanic Quarter to you. You can probably see a white screen at the moment. That's because a video is about to start that was taken live from the reading room in Proni, where Proni's staff, led by Stephen Scarth, and joined by two of our team who you've met already, Tim, Myrta, and David Brown, will be introducing you to the real jewels in the Proni collection that are contributing to this exercise in archival recovery. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Stephen Scarth. I'm Head of Public Services at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, also known as Proni. For those of you who have never visited Proni, we are located in purpose-built premises in the heart of Belfast's historic Titanic Quarter. Proni was born in the wake of the destruction of the Irish Public Record Office in 1922. We were established the following year in 1923 with the remit to be the official archive of the new state of Northern Ireland. The 1923 legislation empowered us to select, preserve, and make available public records. From our inception, we were very aware of what material was lost, and we proactively sought out surrogates to replace what had been destroyed. The archive now holds materials stretching back across 9 centuries, our oldest record dating from 1219. As a core partner of the Beyond 2022 project, Proni is delighted to play its part in the creation of Ireland's Virtual Record Treasury. Today, we'd like to invite you inside the Proni reading room. Proni staff and the Beyond 2022 team are now going to demonstrate how the archive's collections can be used to replace what was once thought lost to the flames. Speaking today will be Dr. Tim Myrta from the Beyond 2022 project, Dr. Dave Brown, also from the Beyond 2022 project, and Jane Hutchinson from Proni.
The Castlereagh papers at Proni are the papers of Robert Stewart, who was Viscount Castlereagh and was later the second Marquess of Londonderry. The papers cover his entire political career, from about 1797 right up until his death in 1822. They cover all of the high offices that Castlereagh held during this period. So he was the Irish Chief Secretary, he was the President of the Board of Control, he was the Secretary for War in the Colonies, he was Foreign Secretary, he was Leader of the House of Commons, and there was his role in the Congress of Vienna, which concluded the Napoleonic Wars. The core of the Castlereagh papers is 37 volumes, which comprise 6,217 documents. The papers were arranged and bound in the 1840s as part of a project to publish a selection of Castlereagh's correspondence. And this was a project which was overseen by Castlereagh's half-brother, Charles Vane. Where the published version has long been regarded as definitive, it turns out that sections of the correspondence have been left out, edited, entirely boulderized, and that there is greater emphasis on some parts of Castlereagh's career than on others. One casualty of this editing is his period as the Irish Chief Secretary. The bound volumes themselves remained in the possession of the Stuart family right up until the 20th century. In 1939, they were relocated from Londonderry House in London to the family seat at Mount Stuart in County Down. They were deposited in Proni in 1974. This volume is taken from Castlereagh's time as Irish Chief Secretary, specifically the correspondence of the summer of 1798. In 1797, when Castlereagh was only 27 years old, he was appointed as Acting Chief Secretary. Castlereagh had been an Irish MP since 1790. A member of a highly successful Irish political family, Castlereagh was a calm, level-headed young man, a first-rate debater and an able administrator. He remained in office even when Lord Camden, who appointed him, was replaced by General Cornwallis. He was officially appointed to the post of Chief Secretary at the end of 1798. This was a highly significant appointment. It was the policy of the government that this position should not be held by Irishmen. However, Cornwallis believed that Castlereagh was so unlike an Irishman, I think he has a just claim to an exception in his favour. Predictably, the papers from Castlereagh's time as Chief Secretary are dominated by two major events: the 1798 rebellion and the passing of the Act of Union. This particular volume includes letters and reports about the military campaign, about the trials of rebels, about information received from government informers and agents abroad, about the landing and movements of the French invasion force and the steps taken to resist it. During the chaotic summer of 1798, when a rebellion was raging, and one that would kill nearly 20,000 people, some described Castlereagh as the only thing holding together the administration in Dublin Castle. As one correspondent to Lord Downshire put it, "We are threatened with an insurrection, probably this very night, if great care is not taken. But we know not who governs, except we look up to Lord Castlereagh." This letter is from James Lanigan, the Catholic Bishop of Ossory, to John Thomas Troy, the Archbishop of Dublin. This is likely to be intercepted mail between two Catholic bishops who were under surveillance. A close correspondent to the Chief Secretary was the Secretary of the Irish Post Office, John Lees, who himself had been an Under-Secretary in the Chief Secretary's office. This letter is describing a sermon recently given by a Catholic priest, which was mischievously misrepresented as being anti-government. It describes how Lanigan preached against radical and republican doctrines, warning the poor people not to be deluded by these monsters. I told them that they should rather lose their lives than take the infernal oath of the United Irishmen. The issue of the Catholic hierarchy encouraging loyalty can be seen in this printed sermon from Troy to the Catholics of Dublin, which decries the influence of Thomas Paine and the French Revolution. In practical speculations on the rights of man and the majesty of the people, on the dignity and independence of the human mind, on the abstract duties of survivors and exaggerated abuses of authority, fatal speculations, disastrous theories, not more subversive of social order and happiness than destructive of every principle of the Christian religion. We bitterly lament the fatal consequences of this anti-Christian conspiracy. As this shows, in 1798, the Catholic bishops were not fans of the United Irishmen and republicanism more generally. Here we have a fairly detailed map of the Dublin Castle complex, its various component buildings, but also showing how it could be accessed by nearby Dublin Street. Despite it being a castle, there were real fears that the seat of British government in Ireland might be seized by insurgents. There's an interesting map which shows the Royal Hospital at Kilmainham. It also shows the distance of the hospital from other locations in Dublin. In a further note, there is a description of how there is no location more eligible than the Royal Hospital. Other sites have been suggested as a possible citadel in the case of an invasion or revolution, and these are the Poor House and a military infirmary hospital in Phoenix Park. All have good and bad qualities. Ultimately, it was recommended that the castle would suffice, as the castle may be made much more defensible against a mob with little expense. This is a letter from the Prime Minister, William Pitt, to the Lord Lieutenant Camden. It's dated the 13th of July 1798. So, what is Pitt writing to Camden about during the middle of a bloody rebellion in which thousands have been killed? Pitt is writing about the sinking fund and the intricacies of the national finance and debt restructuring. This just goes to show that even during a rebellion, the bills have to be paid. How does this material help to replace lost material from the Public Record Office of Ireland? While all of the Castlereagh material is undoubtedly interesting, just look at the job titles that he held. It is the papers from his time as Irish Chief Secretary which are of particular importance to this project. The Chief Secretary's office was quite simply the most important office in the Irish government. It acted as the means of communication between the government in Westminster and its equivalent departments in the Dublin administration and the branch offices in Ireland. It's an office that was in existence from the 16th century right up until 1922. Herbert Woods' guide to the records contained in the Record Office, which was published in 1919, devotes an entire 18 pages to what would have been the contents of the Chief Secretary's office papers. It's hard to put across the significance of the loss of this material because it touched on every area of historical research: political, economic, social, legal history, public history, everything. The fact this material is no longer there is an awful loss. However, the good news is that the material was not lost in its entirety because we have collections like the Castlereagh papers. It was the custom for high-ranking officials to have their own collections of personal and private papers, and there was not a clear distinction between personal and private material. So when an office holder left, he took all of his papers with him. It was for this reason that the State Paper Office created copies. So it was the copies that were sent to the Four Courts to be preserved. When the Four Courts burned down in 1922, it was the copies that were lost. Despite the destruction of 1922, Herbert Wood himself noted, the original documents will still be found in the archives of those noble families whose scions held the great political offices in Ireland. The Castlereagh papers in Proni is one such example of how this material survives.
Okay, so Jane's item she was talking about is an example of a collection of original documents that were preserved. In that case, they were preserved because the official in charge, the Irish Chief Secretary, Castlereagh, took those documents away. Again, the line between official and personal correspondence was somewhat blurry. But in Beyond 2022, we are interested in a range of different types of historical documents. And one type that's really important is transcriptions. These are documents which are not originals, but they are extracts, sometimes full transcriptions of documents that no longer exist. So it's important to remember that in the 19th century, when the Public Record Office of Ireland was first created, this new state archive was really a boon to a whole range of researchers, antiquaries, local historians, and genealogists. And many of these men and women were just habitual note takers and transcribers. If you've ever done a little research into your family history, you'll very quickly come across some big names in Victorian Irish genealogy. While some of the names are better known, men like Tennyson Groves, Thrift, the Swift Abstracts, Crossley, some of these big names of more than a century ago in terms of genealogical research. One example we have today is from a lesser known case, a man called Maxwell Given, whose notebooks and research notes are contained here in Proni. Now, Maxwell Given was born in 1886. He was a native of the town of Coleraine, and he spent his life researching the history of that town. He was a frequent visitor to the Public Record Office in Dublin right up until its destruction in 1922. And indeed, he continued his research right through the 20s and 30s until his untimely death in 1934. And we have today one of the volumes of his notes. The Given collection was actually donated to Proni in the 1990s. And one example, one volume today, shows you a
great example of the range of different documents that Given transcribed and preserved, with many of the originals now lost. So the first example we have here today is extracts from County Londonderry Exchequer Inquisitions. Now, the Inquisitions, Exchequer Inquisitions, were a type of treasury document. What they were was they were an inquiry, an inquisition, into what the rights and privileges of the crown over certain lands, when those lands were held by the tenant-in-chief. When a large landowner would die, the crown, through either the chancery or the exchequer, would basically establish what their rights in this case was. Now, this is a really interesting example because on this page, it mentions that the territory that they're looking at is the country of O'Cahan. This comes into the sort of the heart of the history of Coleraine. The O'Cahan clan were the rulers over much of the territory that is now modern-day County Londonderry. In the 16th century, however, Londonderry did not exist as a county. It was known as County Coleraine, or sometimes colloquially known as O'Cahan country. Now, into the 17th century, the O'Cahan clan fell out of favor with the royal government for many complex reasons, which would take very long to explain. The result being that what had been the O'Cahan country of Coleraine was changed. Sections of what had been County Coleraine were added onto with sections of Antrim, Donegal, and Tyrone to create a new county, County Londonderry, which would be the heart of the Londonderry plantation, obviously after 1613. So what you're seeing here on this page is not just a standard inquiry into legal rights over land, it's a document that's also at the heart of the Ulster plantation. Now we have an example from the other end of the 17th century, from the 1690s. Now this is a document that Given transcribed from the Public Record Office in Dublin. You can see he's written it here from the diocesan collection. He even gives the bundle and the bay and shelf number. Now, these are papers which he's actually unsure of the dating, which is really interesting. You're getting an insight into how the researcher worked. He thinks it's either 1696 or 1694. But what it is an inquiry into the clergy, the Catholic clergy referred to in the document as the Popish clergy, who are still living in the various parishes of the Diocese of Derry. And it actually gives a description of some of the priests and in some cases friars who are still active in these parishes. Now, the context for this document is the era known as the Penal Laws. After the Williamite Wars of 1689 to 1691, the outward demonstrations of the Catholic faith were either highly regulated or prohibited, and there was a series of civil disabilities imposed on the Catholic majority of Ireland. There was great care taken to understand and to monitor the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland, and this is one great example. But it also gives us a really interesting insight into some of the realities, the lived realities of religious practice in Ireland in the 1690s. I'll choose just one example. In the townland of Cumber, it says, "There is no Popish priest yet lives in this parish, but mass is said there by Shane or John O'Cahan." Again, that name O'Cahan coming up. O'Cahan is aged about 56 years. He dwells in Ballydonegal, in the parish of Banner. He is exercising ecclesiastical jurisdiction by divorcing and declaring marriages void. He is a most malicious, ill-inclined, and designing man. So clearly whoever was doing this inquiry didn't have a very high opinion of O'Cahan as sort of a secular quasi-priest. Now, the context of the penal laws and sort of the long 18th century in which Irish Catholics suffered under these civil disabilities is also the context for the next item we're going to look at. Now, throughout the 18th century, there was a great anxiety amongst administrators and the government in Dublin Castle about the Catholic majority. Were they loyal? Could they be relied upon? Did they actually harbor loyalty instead to the exiled Catholic King James II, living in exile on the continent? For that reason, that anxiety about Catholic loyalties, there was a huge anxiety, around great fear, about establishing just exactly the numbers and proportion of Catholics to Protestants in Ireland. That, however, began to change towards the end of the 18th century. In 1766, the son of James II, the old pretender to the throne, died. And suddenly, there was a little bit less fear about a Catholic rebellion in pursuit of a Stuart monarchy. And not coincidentally, that very same year, 1766, the Irish Parliament commissioned a religious census. Now, the census was to be carried out by the Church of Ireland clergy in the various parishes, but there were no instructions about what was to be included or about how it was to be carried out. It was simply stated that they were to ascertain the proportion or the number, raw numbers of Catholics and Protestants. We have an example from that 1766 census here in the given collection. There are many examples in other collections, but this one is in itself very interesting. You'll notice that although it gives you the numbers of Protestants and, again, that term Papists, Catholics, it doesn't subdivide Protestants into Presbyterians or to members of the established church, the Church of Ireland. However, what it does do is, again, like that previous example, give you notes on some members of the Catholic clergy who are active in the various parishes. So you can see here, again, the example of Cumber, one resident Papish priest, 2 or sometimes 3 vagrant friars who don't reside, but often officiate here. Again, a little insight into the lived realities of religious life in Derry of the 18th century. One other example of a type of document that Given was really interested in transcribing were these, printed proclamations. And again, you can see here, volume 7 of the printed proclamations in the Record Office of Dublin. Now, he transcribed these in 1906. Now, thankfully, a good number of these proclamations survive, and there is actually a multi-volume edition by the Irish Manuscript Commission. A lot of these were reproduced in a thing called the Dublin Gazette, which is also a focus for Beyond 2022. But this is nonetheless a really great example of the type of stuff local historians looked at in the early 1900s. They give a great insight, these proclamations. These are official proclamations from the Lord Lieutenant or the Lord Justices. They give you a little insight into how law and order was enforced in the early 1700s. Proclamations against highwaymen, against agrarian redressor groups. This one example from 1719 is a proclamation stating that 2 men, Shane O'Haran and Shane O'Mullen, unless they turn themselves in by August of that year, 1719, if they haven't turned themselves in, then they will be charged for high treason for their crimes as highwaymen. A really great, vivid example of the type of thing that was both in local history and folklore by the early 1900s. Now, not everything that Given transcribed would necessarily have found its way into the forecourts, and not all of it's going to be necessarily the focus of a project like Beyond 2022, but nonetheless, it is still really rich. It gives you a great example of, once again, what local historians were interested in. So, for example, Given was really interested in the history of printing in Coleraine, and one of the earliest examples he had of local printing was the printing of theatre handbills, advertisements for local theatrical productions. You can see here he gives several examples from the year 1782. If you were living in Coleraine, you could take in a production of Othello, as well as several local farces, which he actually lists. He even actually sketches out what the handbill would have looked like. So we see here 2 examples of lesser known plays. Othello and Shakespeare, it's very well known. Here we have Midas and 2 other presumably farces, Busybody and The Mock Doctor. So it's not always high theatrical fare. Now, this is the final example from Given's notebook that I want to show you. It is a sketch he's done from the Down survey maps. Now, some of the Down survey maps were destroyed in 1922, but other versions exist. This is one sketch he has taken from them. Now, interestingly, he actually gives a story about the nature and origin of this map that actually doesn't seem to be entirely true. But you can show how, even within this notebook, he's sketching out the little parts that are relevant to him. However, when it comes to that Down survey, we are very lucky to have someone who's much more of an expert than me on those maps, and that is Dave Brown, who'll be the next person speaking today.
As Tim has mentioned, the next object we're going to look at is an atlas of Down survey maps. These were originally made by Sir William Petty following the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1650s. The set we have in Proni is one of only 2 examples out of many, many thousands of maps that were originally made that are certified copies from the Public Record Office or its predecessor, the Record Tower in Dublin Castle. There's this one set from Antrim, which contains approximately 30 maps, and another set in Sligo County Library that contains a similar number. So although there are thousands and thousands of survivors, these are very, very rare. Most of the northern half of County Antrim was mapped by petty surveyors. The idea was that following the Cromwellian conquest, all of land that was owned by either people who supported the Irish Rebellion of 1641 or people who supported Charles I in the decade of civil war that followed would have their lands confiscated. The Earl of Antrim, who was a Catholic landowner, owned the northern half of County Antrim, so petty surveyors were sent out to find out what he had, survey the lands, map it all out, and give it to people who had entered a lottery to receive it. The Down Survey was organised by county, then by barony, and then by parish. So a map was made of each barony, and then separate maps were made of every single parish. The total set we approximate came to around 2,500 maps. The original maps for County Antrim, most of them were destroyed in 1711 in an earlier fire that happened in Dublin Castle. The final set of maps was destroyed in 1922. So what we're not looking at here is an original. We're looking at a copy, but it's a certified copy, so it is as close as can be to the original map. It was made by William Molesworth, the Surveyor General of Ireland, in about the 1720s, following the death of the third Earl, where again they wanted to re-establish what his estate comprised. It is a striking example of early modern cartography. It's very, very heavily illustrated. For people who know the island of Rathlin, the first thing that strikes you is that the map is actually upside down. In those days, it wasn't normal to orientate all maps to the north like we do now. Most of them were orientated to the east, which is where the expression orientation came from. Why this map is orientated to the south, we don't know. It may well be that the surveyor simply preferred it that way. The surveyor's name was William Carcass, who did quite a few of these maps around the country. Compared with other down survey maps, the map of Rathlin is actually quite sparse. It has very little detail and very brief descriptions of the land. It just says arable or pasture. And one of the reasons for this is because Rathlin was used as a staging post for Scottish soldiers who were being sent to Ireland to fight in the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And by local accounts, after they had left, there wasn't a blade of grass left on the island. So the island was almost entirely stripped bare during the 1640s. So by the time the maps came to be made in the 1650s, it was effectively barren apart from a couple of destroyed castles. However attractive they are, the maps are really about confiscation. The landowner had to prove his innocence under the Cromwellian regime. The Cromwellians did not have to prove that he had been guilty of rebelling against the king, because Randall MacDonald actually didn't rebel against the king. He was not a friend of the parliamentarians. Randall MacDonald was lucky in a way in that he was hopeless with money. So in 1637, he'd actually mortgaged his entire estate to a powerful group of Puritan merchants in London. And they passed this mortgage from one to the other over a period of about 20 years. Very much in the same way as mortgages were sold off by banks here in the early part of the 21st century. The mortgage became of increasingly less value as it became less likely that MacDonald would ever actually be able to redeem it. But it eventually fell into the hands of a very powerful financier by the name of Sir Martin Noel. So Martin Noel reckoned he would get his hands on the northern half of the Antrim estate. So it basically protected it in a way from confiscation. Because Noel was a very, very powerful person in London, nobody really wanted to get into an argument with him about, well, I've just been given this land, so you have to give it to me. It wasn't going to happen. Noel is better known as a founder of the Royal Africa Company. He had his hands in lots and lots of pies. He owned land in Barbados. He owned shipping all over the place. He had farmed all the taxes for Ireland in the late 1650s. That means that whatever taxes the state was hoping to receive in a year, Noel would pay them an estimate and keep the profits. So he was a very, very important person. What he has in common actually with William Molesworth is that Noel was involved in the shipping of Scots and Irish captives from Coleraine in the 1650s during the Cromwellian regime. And Molesworth's grandfather, Robert Molesworth, was doing the same thing in Dublin. He was a merchant who got involved in this shipping of captives and selling them in Barbados. So they have something in common. And we find that Irish history and Irish records are full of these little interconnections that you find. But there is, overall, there's a paradox to these maps. They are very attractive. Some of them are actually quite beautiful, but they really tell a very sad story. They tell a story of confiscation and a story of loss. The fact that the maps themselves, these maps of Antrim, were lost twice, once in 1711 and once again in 1922. We're just fortunate that we still have these survivors so we can see how people depicted their own world.
The documents we showcase today illustrate the rich variety of records held by Proni and other such archival institutions. Using these records, we can rediscover and repopulate the virtual repository as it was in 1922. These discoveries are made possible because of the catalogues that have been compiled over many years and which are now accessible online. They are also made accessible through the provision of facilities like this reading room, where researchers can consult original records. In this respect, the physical space of the archive and its search rooms remains central to the Beyond 2022 project. They remain hubs for discovery and exploration and are not so dissimilar to the original search rooms like that of the Public Record Office of Ireland.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely wonderful. Thanks particularly to Jane Hutchinson and Tim Merton and Dave Brown, of course, from the project. For me, I'm just a medievalist. My period is before 1500. So for me also, I'm learning every time I see these experts look at these documents and reveal to us the beauty and the richness of what lies within them. And I think what comes across so strongly is the sheer range of material, geographically and chronologically, and the depth that we can look forward to probing as they get congregated and we can begin to explore them. One thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and I'll just say it briefly, is that some of the Proni materials are already available on the Beyond 2022 website. If you go to our website, www.beyond2022.ie, and we've got an explore page, you'll find a Proni collection. And anything that's in that page is already searchable. And this is enabled through technologies that we are supporting that unlock the handwriting of manuscript materials, and it also works on print materials. So we generate across this phase of the project an incredibly powerful resource of searchable manuscript and print, which we'll then be placing back onto the virtual shelves. And speaking of virtual shelves, it takes me nicely to my our last segment. And I showed you the video right at the start of this session at 2 o'clock. And at the start of the summer, that was just a computer graphics reconstruction, a vision for the future. The work of the summer and Beyond 2022, working with the ADAPT Centre at Trinity, which is the Computer Science Centre, has been to turn that vision into a reality. So we don't have to wait 2 years to enter the Virtual Record Treasury. Right now on the homepage of Beyond 2022, you can go down to the bottom of the homepage and there's a link. And for the next 10 or so days, you can enter the Virtual Record Treasury and start exploring yourself. We only have a few items in there. It's experimental, but nonetheless, you can begin to see how it will feel, how you'll experience it. But to give you a sense of it, I'm introducing you now to the two people who are instrumental in building that experience. Anton Gerdelan is a computer scientist and specialist in virtual reality in the ADAPT Centre, and Kieran Wallace, you've heard speak a couple of times in this afternoon's events. Kieran is Deputy Director of the project and an expert in the Public Record Office of Ireland, and they're going to give you a guided tour of the Public Record Office as it was back on the eve of the fire. Over to you, Kieran and Anton.
Good afternoon. I'm Anton. Will I start talking?
Please.
So I'll give you a little bit of background to where we are at this event. So there has been in past iterations some work with virtual reality demonstrations on the project before, but when I joined the project at the start, roughly at the start of this pandemic happening, our existing model wouldn't really work because obviously we have people stuck at home, and the existing plan was to have a laptop, quite a powerful laptop, with a tethered headset attached to it, and we'd take it to the event and people would line up and have a go. And obviously that's not a very workable model anymore. So we had to very quickly rethink how we were going to deliver this technology to people. And it gave us a nice opportunity as well. So what we did was start moving to the web. And in the last few years, there have been some really interesting developments with 3D graphics technology on the web through a web browser. So if you're reading Google or whatever it is with a typical web browser, these things can now actually display 3D graphics as you would find in a video game or a viewer for an architectural model. And there's a very new set of technologies called WebVR and WebXR, which also let you, if you happen to have a headset, a virtual reality headset, you can hit a button and switch from a 3D view to it actually playing through your headset. And I think I could probably just share my screen, start sharing my screen now so you can see what I'm talking about. Rather than look at a blank image. Okay. Yep. All right, hopefully that's coming through.
Yeah, it is, Anton. Go ahead.
Okay, so what we've done is taken our existing model. We were a bit concerned because it was built for a very powerful standalone computer that it might not work very well if you're trying to access it through your web browser. So it was a bit new and experimental, and this is the very first version of this, as Peter was explaining, and we have quite a lot of time now to build iterations and explore where we can go with this technology. So to give you a brief example, you're now looking at this is a regular web browser, and if you go to beyond2022.ie, you can try this yourself. And it should run on, if you have a reasonably powerful computer or a laptop, it should run okay. It seems to work for most people. If you have a headset, I don't think many people do, but some of you might, you can try it. It works with some reasonably well. And to try that out, there's a little button in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen here. And if you hit that, you'll see a view. It'll split the display and draw it twice for the left and right eye for your headset and give you a little hint of what that might look like if you had your virtual reality headset on. The nice additional benefits that this kind of technology gives us is you don't need to turn up for an event at all. You can try it from home, you can try it internationally, and we can now share it with a much bigger audience who can participate in this experience with us and discover the archives. It also has the nice benefit that you can run it on a variety of different pieces of technology. So it seems to work reasonably well, even on fairly recent tablets and mobile phone devices as well. So you can give it a try, and when you first jump in, you'll see this. That gives you some very basic instructions for how you can get going. I think I can now hand over to Kieran, and we're going to give you a guided tour. So if you're not inclined to explore this yourself, or you'd like some additional historical background to this you wouldn't get, we can give you that now.
Super, thanks Anton for that. And it struck me when Anton showed the goggle view, the two-screen view. This is very like, some of you might have seen those old Victorian bioscope, I think they called them, where they took two slightly different angle photographs and you could put them into kind of viewer, which you put on a sort of a screen in front of your nose. So the precursor of 3D in Victorian times, which is just the time that this building was actually built. So Anton's going to drive the car and I'll do the talking. What we're doing is we're standing in front of the Public Record Office of Ireland as it was built in 1867. So this building, just to get a sort of sense here, stand back and look at the outside of it, this is a handsome cut stone building. It's built in a neoclassical design. It looks to me a little like a bank in any city or large provincial town. And I think that idea of a bank is making it looks solid, it looks reliable, it looks secure. And that's not a mistake, because it was to be a secure place for storing records. And indeed the records are held in the treasury. So the idea of bank, treasury, something that's valuable and worth keeping, is all built into this idea. The photograph Anton's closing in on there is a very nice photograph. Indeed, it's the only sort of proper architectural photograph we have of the exterior of the building. The picture was taken in 1914, and it shows you in its heyday. So this is the Public Record Office of Ireland in its heyday. You'll see that there are two elements to the building. The front block, kind of a smaller square block, is the administration block, and behind it, the block with the tall arched windows, is the record treasury, where the actual archives and records were stored. The front block was where the staff worked, where the public came, where you had open fireplaces and coal fires to heat the rooms. It's where you had gas mantle lights. It's where you had perhaps smokers even working in their offices. It was seen as a risk of fire. And the whole risk, everything that archivists knew over the many centuries, was that fire and records don't go well together. So the archive was a separate building at the back. So it's actually a separate block at the back, which was the actual treasury building with the arched windows. So let's walk around the corner and just get a side view of the premises. As we go around, you'll see that the railings follow all the way around, but there's kind of a gap, an area between the railings and the building itself. There's about a 6 foot drop set about 6 foot back from the walls, again, to give added security. So we're about halfway along the building now. To our left, you'll see is the record house, the front administration block. If you just pan a little to the left, Anton, thanks very much. The window that's sort of there in the center of your screen now, that ground floor window, is the strong room. That's where, if you were working in the old Public Record Office of Ireland on a set of records and it came to closing time on a Monday and you said, oh, I need to go back for these on Tuesday, the archivist would offer to hold them in the strong room overnight rather than return them to the security of the main treasury itself. So the strong room played an important role in our story, as we'll see later on. So that's the front block, the dangerous fire block, if you like. Behind, with the tall arch windows, just panning to the right, is the actual record treasury itself. This is 5 stories over a stone vaulted basement. As we peer through the windows, you can see the daylight flooding in from a very long gallery of glass along the top floor. The entire centre portion of the roof was all glass. These tall windows were to allow lots of natural light into the building because it didn't have gas lights or candle lights in the building for fear of fire. And that purpose-built sort of idea was made very modern. This is state-of-the-art design for galleries, for archives at the time. Between the two, if you just angle up slightly, Anton, to see, you'll see the screen wall. So that wall, that's kind of a short wall between the two buildings, that is just like a dummy screen. What lies behind that is a void, an actual deliberate gap of air between the two buildings to prevent fire traveling from the left-hand building, as we look at it, to the right-hand building. The two buildings were only joined at ground floor level by a sort of a short metal passageway which could be pulled down in case of a fire. The idea was to protect the building at the right, the record treasury, from fire in the building at the left. What actually happened in the black and white photograph just hovering there tantalizingly in front of us, what actually happened was in the event was that the building behind, the record treasury, was what went up in flames. And you see there a gruesome photograph of the actual level of destruction, which is fairly complete. That in 30th of June 1922 was destroyed at the end of the Battle of the Four Courts, at the start of the Irish Civil War. The fire gap worked, but it worked in the opposite direction. The fire break stopped the fire moving from the rear building where the records were destroyed to the front treasury, to the front administration block. So let's go around into that administration block because that still survives today. We'll move around the corner back to the front entrance. As we're going around, it just struck me, as a colleague was pointing out earlier on today, it's a pleasure to walk into a public building without seeing a yellow and black notice and having a dispenser to make you wash your hands before you walk in the door. So maybe another unintended virtue of the virtual world. Here we are inside the virtual record, inside the inside the actual record treasury of 1867. The stairwell is very elaborate. If you look up, it's stretching up a number of stories there. Off this stairwell, there are offices for staff. The deputy keeper's office is there. The staff library is there. And at the top of the building are the residences of the family flat of J.J. Tucker, the foreman of the workers. He had a flat at the top and some storerooms at the very bottom. When you log on and go to the site yourself, you can actually go up the stairs yourself. We'll stay on the ground floor for the moment, but you can sort of have a bit of rummage around. But let's proceed from this nice, handsome stone stairway, nice, secure stone stairway, in through the doors into the actual search room itself. Now, as we're looking around the search room, you see the beautiful ceilings there, lots of light flooding in from on top, no side windows. It's all top lit to allow for kind of safer light for the documents. And you can see the gas lamps there. These are all sort of period designs of the gas lamps hanging from the ceiling. All the furnishings, all the fittings, the layout of the building as you see it there are all gone and removed now. This is now entirely converted into a modern courthouse. It's Court 7 of the Court of Appeal. So none of this has been seen for 100 years. We're stepping back 100 years into this venue. As you look around the building, you'll see on the right-hand side is where the archivist worked behind a public counter, and on the left-hand side is where the readers sat at the reading desks. So I want to introduce you to one important gentleman here. So to show you the reading desks on the left, sorry Anton, I'm going too fast for you. Over on the right-hand side, behind the working desks here is Sir Samuel Ferguson. So Samuel Ferguson is a Belfast man. He trained as a barrister. He studied in Trinity College, never really practiced much in law, but he became the first deputy keeper of the Public Record Office of Ireland. One of those admirable kind of Victorian gentlemen where he, as I say, trained as a barrister. He was an excellent archivist, an antiquarian. He studied ancient Irish traditional folk song. He was a poet in his own right. Also, a fact that's not much known about him, that has emerged from our research, is that he was also kind of a wannabe engineer. The early records, the very opening years of the Public Record Office of Ireland, have many letters written by Samuel Ferguson. As he went through sort of the snag list, he'd been handed this new building and he's going through the snag list, writing to the window manufacturers and the shelving manufacturers with detailed letters with metal clasps and fittings that he wanted, and his drawings and measurements, and telling them, make this clasp, make this fitting, make this press door, and so forth, in his own letters. So this is Samuel Ferguson, and he oversees this huge influx of records that start moving into the building from the 1860s onwards. Wagons trundling in from all sorts of repositories around Ireland to fill the shelves that we're going to see shortly. To the left of Samuel, to our left rather, as Samuel Ferguson, is the strong room door in the back corner. This is the strong room where records were held, as I said, overnight. We saw the outside window earlier. People who were working here on the 14th of April, 1922, that's the Holy Thursday just before, or sorry, Good Friday, just before the occupation by the anti-treaty forces that led to the battle and the destruction of the forecourts. People who worked there on records on that Good Friday evening before close of business handed in their records and said, I'll be back on Tuesday after the bank holiday to pick up my research, but alas, they were never to get back inside the building again. However, those particular sets of records are some of the ones that would have survived the flames and went into the salvaged record collections that Zoe spoke so interestingly about earlier on. So the strong room is a key place for us where records survived. Just up on the left, hanging on the wall, we've put it on the virtual wall, is a photograph that Tim showed you earlier on in his presentation. This is the only black and white, the only image of the interior of this building. And it's from this image that our colleagues in NoHo Design, who made this virtual model, they made the basic frame of the model, and Anton's made sort of the movement through it, if you like. They made this, using this photograph, they were able to design, and with one visit to the building, able to design the virtual reality model we're looking at here. If you can get any bit closer to that photograph, Anton, I'm not sure if we can, just scooch around the corner there. You'll see on the person to the far right of the photograph is Herbert Wood. We'll meet him in a moment. And to the second in from the right is D.A. Chart. So there's Herbert Wood and David Chart working away at their desks in 1914. Within a decade, Chart will have retired and gone to England. Wood will have retired and gone to England, and D.A. Chart will have gone north to set up Proni. So they're working together in the old record office. Herbert Wood is the author of Wood's Guide to the Public Record Office of Ireland. So let's go and see the actual book he wrote. This is sometimes called the saddest book in Irish history. And we have a copy of it here on the reading desk. And this book is about 500 pages long. It contains listings of about 5,500 collections and series of records. So it doesn't list the actual what's in every box. It just lists what the major collections are and gives you a guide to how they arrived into the record office. So this is like the beginnings of a catalogue, and was the main spine of our investigation as to how we were going to find what was lost. But I think, Anton, you wanted to say something about how this is actually framed and presented to the viewer.
Yeah, you might have noticed there that the page turned. So this was actually our first experiment in accessing what is starting to become a very impressive database of the digital reconstruction of the records through the internet, and display those in our virtual model. So I think this was the first taste for us of, oh wow, you can actually grab, because they've been very meticulously indexed and cataloged and made accessible with the digital part of this project. It was really easy to grab the scans of these pages of this book and display them. So we can actually turn through the entire book if we want to. And that was really insightful, because it says, oh, there's lots of interesting stuff we can do with actually accessing this information and displaying it in interesting ways. So look out for more of this sort of thing as the project proceeds.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly it. So while we're moving in a sort of a Victorian space, what we're seeing is very much a 21st century technology that's sort of supporting all that we're interacting with. If you went in as a user into the record office, you might flick through this or consult an archivist at this counter, but you might also just go across to the far desk on the left-hand side where we've put up at the next counter. This is, it is like a cross-section of the building. If we just zoom in a bit closer on it there, and on the bottom left corner, you can normally see it, Anton. Yeah, you'll just see the word vaults written at the bottom left-hand corner, the extreme bottom left corner. And what you see is a grid. This grid is like a slice through the record treasury where we're going to go in a moment. And it's showing you the vaults, the ground floor, and the 5 floors above ground of records and where they're all stored. It's like a location map, and the staff would have used this to find their way to the major collections. As I say, not listing every single page, just where the major collections were located. One map for the right-hand side of the building for the west side, and one map for the east side of the building. What we've done here, if you were working in this space as an actual researcher, you'd request a document, and then a document will be brought to you at the reading desk. So just over the edge of the page, you can see the reading desks just in behind. If you tilt up a little, Anton, and those nice green lamps and those comfortable chairs, you'll be sitting there in this wooden chair with your desk in front of you and your wooden book prop in front of you, and that's where you do your research. Now, we've highlighted on this grid here some Ulster records, which are replacements for records lost in 1922. But as we're in a virtual reality environment, same way as we don't have to wash our hands, we can sneak through into the actual archive behind without permission of the archivist. So while Herbert Wood and Samuel Ferguson aren't watching, let's go through the doors into the record treasury and do something we would never normally be allowed to do. So we're passing through the fire break, the covered fire break, and into the 1867 record treasury. So this space is this high, bright space, all those empty shelves. We're seeing it really as it would only have been seen once in history in 1867. No one's seen inside in this condition since the day it opened in 1867 with its empty shelves and its bare floors. And you'll see all the metal walkways, all the timber used in the building was fire-resistant timber. They used as little timber as they could and made it metal walkways and metal supports to make it as fireproof as possible. If you just go to that hanging poster photograph in the center, you can see so this is a photograph taken from 1914, the only interior photograph of the premises. You can see this in larger on our website. So this is the staff working away, and you might just make out the staff these are archivists and searchers. They had a great name called searchers. So if you ordered a record, a searcher would go and find. This wasn't a 1950s skiffle band. The searchers was an actual profession. And so the searchers would bring the records out into the daylight in the central atrium. There were no lights amongst the shelves. So if they were working on a document, they would bring it out to a shelf and lean over into the daylight to read it. And they're writing up catalogs, they're arranging collections and making all the different arrangements that are needed to be made for an efficient record treasury to do its business, as this was a very efficient and very successful record treasury. All those empty shelves around you that you see are all filled by 1912. They're actually looking for more space by 1912. So there's never enough capacity in any archive. While we're here, let's go up and actually have a look at a record on a shelf. So we can navigate up a flight of stairs and we'll go up and find one of the Ulster records, which is a replacement record for a lost original lost in the fire in Dublin. And this is placed on a shelf. And this is just, it's identifying what the record is. You can see many sort of anxiety-filled empty shelves all around it. That's our job, is to fill as many of those shelves as we can in a virtual reality. But this particular one is a beautiful scroll, which we could now take this out. It's a patent to create Viscount Clandeboy, who's James Hamilton. And if we pull that out from the shelf, it'll now transport us back to the reading desk. So we'll jump back to the reading desk, and here we are back on the desk with James Hamilton's patent in front of him. I mean, you can see there's a beautiful document. So you see why words like treasury and jewels and things are used. The color of this is fantastic. If you're interested in more detail on this document, actually, Stephen Scarth of Proni has written an excellent blog about it. If you Google Beyond 2022 and Clandeboy, it'll bring you to the blog on it, and he explains the origins of the document and who Hamilton was. A document written in the reign of James I, and certainly when you were appointed a Viscount then, you knew all about it from the beauty of what you saw. Now, we went and nicked that off the shelf ourselves. Let's do this a proper way. If you're going back to the schematic, to the actual cross-section, we'll just pull out two more examples of Ulster records that we have. One I want to show you just here is the Dublin Gazette, and this is the Gazette that Dave showed you earlier on. This is showing you how you can pull it from the shelf. It's from the 1757 one, and this is the one with that grim story from Ocker. We won't go through the awful gory details of the case again, but it shows you how the kind of ways in our prototype that you'll be able to look at a document, zoom in on a document, and all this design that goes around how this is presented to you as a viewer is stuff that we're working on now. So it's very much research-led. So this isn't just delivering a thing, we're actually developing new concepts as to how to present documents here. The final one I want to show you is, if you go around to the schematic again, please, Anton. The final one I want to show you is this map. This is the map of Rathlin. And again, Dave showed you this in real paper form. And the map here from the offset, this is the island of Rathlin. And it is showing you the barony and county that it's in. And again, this is the upside down map. This is the map where the top of the map is pointing south. And this is the island that was, as we whatever, left stripped bare by the Scottish soldiers in the 17th century. But so there's a real paper replacement. This is a 1720s replacement of a lost down survey original from the previous century. It exists in paper form in Proni, but researchers from all around the world can see it on its, like, on the same shelf where its Dublin original would have sat, if you like. So as we would find other down survey maps, we could bring them together onto the one shelf and see some maps from Proni, some maps from the Bodleian and Oxford, some maps from the United States, some maps from the National Archives of Ireland, brought together on a virtual shelf. So you see the collection in its coherent original form. So from this map, let's just from this map, let's go back to the schematic, to the cross-section, and just take a view from inside the record treasury, from the sort of the top position inside the record treasury. So Anton's driving around some awkward corners there. I'm speaking as he jumps, and here we are up in the top inside of the building. From here, we're up under the roof. You see all the glasswork of the roof here. Look at the amount of shelves, look at the size of the work we have to do. This is perhaps a sobering moment for all of us to see this amount of work to be done, but we are finding lots. Dave has mentioned lots of the stuff we have found with our researchers in London and Belfast and Dublin, and our research connections with 30 other institutions around the world. We're finding many, many records. But from here, we can also see a virtual thing. All the records we find, by their nature, are virtual. They're all data. So all the data from these records will enter into a database. All of the names, the place names, the person names, we'll be able to make the connections. So as David Brown was saying in his speech about the map of Rathlin Island, with landowners in different parts of the country and making links between them, we'll be able to make sort of very interesting database links to all of these and things that couldn't have been found in a real world. So in a way, we're going beyond what you could have done if the fire had never actually happened. We're going deeper into the records than when they existed in paper and parchment form. So do go to the website, play on our website. If you go into beyond2022.ie, scroll down one screen and you'll see either the flat screen or the goggles version that you can zoom into and have a look at yourself at your own leisure. And with that, I'll hand back over to Peter. Thanks, Anton.
Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Kieran and Anton, absolutely brilliant. A few colleagues today have said that they have the best job in the world. I think Zoe said it and Dave said it. I can assure you that I am the person who has the best job in the world, because I get to be director of the project, and the talent of these colleagues who put this together at both ends of the spectrum, computer science and then humanities, is just so exciting. And I look at that and it's just the dream of a few years ago coming into reality, and you know, we should all be so proud to see it coming to fruition in this way. Kieran ended on a very important point, which is that restocking the shelves with lots of stuff is only actually half the problem. Having created all this new content, we have to provide you, the public or archival partners, with new ways to search across it. And I mentioned that the materials that are already on the website are fully text searchable, and they include the Woods Guide of 1919 that Anton paused on and turned the pages. That Woods Guide in the virtual space now is being drawn dynamically from our database. So just at the level of the technical challenge of putting a database and hooking it up to a virtual scene that you can live now see through your web browser, we've already proven that that's not some future ambition. We can already do that. How we then begin to connect those records becomes the next challenge. And on that point, I mentioned the text searchability. I wanted to just note as a point of pride that we are in Beyond 2022 through the Trinity Library, a founding member of a consortium a cooperative called Transcribus, a European project that has transformed handwritten manuscript writing into text searchable documents. And Transcribus won an award within the last days, a European Horizons Impact Award. So we're very proud within Beyond 2022 to be benefiting from that European connection and using it to bring together archival collections from all our core partners and our participating institutions. Okay, that is our presentations for this afternoon.